Buongiorno e bentrovati a tutti.
Good morning and welcome to everybody. My House is You. Discovering oneself as a man, by reading Dickens. This is what we're going to talk about and the journey we're going to take with our guests today, Professor Alison Milbank and Professor Edoardo Rialti. I have used the word a journey, a trip, because even if we're going to stay sitting down, in fact, we're about to accompany and go on a journey with Charles Dickens, who, writing, surrounded himself with hundreds of characters. And in fact, they can't really be called characters because they are real people, almost in flesh and blood. And perhaps it's too little to say that he was surrounded by these characters because he was literally overwhelmed, buried by so many characters that he created. He created figures of very different men, extravagant, exuberant men. He has looked into all the various types of human beings that exist, young people, old people, nice and horrible people, exuberant and wicked, wretched and blessed, a volcano of characters issued from the pen of Dickens. In fact, I discovered this as a translator, and I discovered that in fact there is an encyclopedia that brings together all the characters that Dickens ever invented. Many of these characters have a name that we all recognize because they've become household words. Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, Nicholas Nickleby, Pickwick, and so many others. Together with titles like Hard Times, A Christmas Carol, and so on, these books have become classics. And sometimes when we use the word a classic novel or book, we tend to put a label on these books as if to say, well, these are books that everybody knows about, and perhaps because for some reason, odd reason, they also happen to be masterpieces. Now, I would have tended to leave this abstract label on Dickens' work, in fact, to call them masterpieces but not read them, had not another great man and writer tried to bring Dickens back to my full attention. And of course, I'm referring to Gilbert Chesterton, who, as you know, had his summer residence here. And I'd like to invite you to go and see his house, if you haven't done so already. He was a great scholar and a lover of Dickens, Chesterton. This link between Chesterton and Dickens will emerge from today's talk because both of the presenters are very skilled also in Chesterton. Now, I'd just like to confine myself to this brief introduction and quote Chesterton. In fact, in a particular contest, he said of Dickens, if possible, a certain type of modern book should be destroyed, said Chesterton. These books should be, in fact, be made explode by a great satirist, and the words of Dickens. Now, the books that Chesterton wanted to have destroyed using Dickens as a dynamite were these books that pretended to give truths to men based on scientific data alone, but only show authors who are simply looking in the mirror and see the reflection of themselves. Chesterton says that Dickens is dynamite that should help to blow up these books. And in fact, this explosive quality of Dickens, I'm sure we will hear of from our two speakers. I'd like to start with Professor Alison Milbank. I'd like to thank her for coming. She's a friend that probably many of you already know because she's been to the meeting several times. I'd like to say a few things about her, and then I'd like to give her the floor right off. Alison Milbank is an Anglican pastor, and she's an associate professor of literature and philosophy at the Nottingham University, and she also taught in Cambridge and Virginia universities. Her academic research focus on Gothic themes, and the work that she is doing now is entitled God and the Gothic. And also with regard to Dickens, she did her doctorate dissertation and thesis looking at the Gothic elements in Dickens, and also she has been the editor of many Victorian novels, as she has looked at Tolkien as a theological writer and done many other publications. I'd like to give her the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Annalisa, for your kind words. It is always a great pleasure to be at the meeting. And by now, I can say, you are my home, my Italian home. So, thank you. Charles Dickens was born in 1812 in my own home city of Portsmouth, on the south coast of England, the son of a naval clerk who was always falling into debt. He died at the height of his fame as a novelist in 1870 and was buried, as national heroes are in Britain, in Westminster Abbey in London. Today he is loved and admired as much as ever, and there are Dickens societies in which people sometimes dress up as his characters in every corner of the world. What is it that draws people to these vast novels 150 years later? Isn't the world of smog and Victorian hypocrisy long over? We don't send children up chimneys or confine them in workhouses like Oliver Twist anymore, do we? Not in Italy and in Britain, perhaps, but child exploitation carries on elsewhere, and many of the clothes we wear or the gadgets we use are made by children or people working in appalling conditions. Dickens' cry of injustice is as much needed today as ever. What he would have made of African child soldiers. Dickens speaks to our meeting theme precisely because he sees the human person as under threat, not just from unjust work practices, but from a variety of causes: social, political, and also moral. As the daughter of a utilitarian headmaster, Thomas Gradgrind recognizes when she exclaims, "How could you give me life and take from me all the inappreciable things that raise it from the state of conscious death? Where are the graces of my soul? Where are the sentiments of my heart? What have you done, O Father? What have you done with the garden that should have bloomed once in this great wilderness here?" said Louisa as she touched her heart. Dickens attacks anything that does not allow the graces of the soul to develop, or the feelings of the heart. In Hard Times, Dickens' critique of political economy, Gradgrind is part of an industrial capitalist system that sees education purely as a means of getting on, providing a workforce that can be used like a machine. He says, now what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. This is not so different from what is happening to education in my own country today. Britain has lost the idea of education as about developing the full person and offering a vision of the good, the true, and the beautiful, in which the scholar unites with these ideas. For us, education is not even about facts, but about skills that make us into cogs in a great wheel. There is no risk of education for us. An inspector comes to Mr. Gradgrind's school and interrogates the students. Suppose you were going to carpet a room. Would you use a carpet having a representation of flowers upon it? The answer should be no, because he wants the cheapest, most practical product. But one little girl, Sissy Jupe, replies that she would, because, if you please, sir, I am very fond of flowers. He replies sarcastically, and is that why you would put tables and chairs upon them, and have people walking over them with heavy boots? It wouldn't hurt them, sir. They wouldn't crush and wither, if you please. They would be the pictures of what was very pretty and pleasant. And I would fancy... Aye, but you mustn't fancy, cried the gentleman, quite elated by coming so happily to his point. That's it. You are never to fancy. You are not Cecilia Jupe, Thomas Gradgrind solemnly repeated, to do anything of that kind. Gradgrind fears imagination because it links the person to freedom and to ideas beyond the monetary. But for Dickens, imagination is the way to human fulfillment. No matter how oppressed and poor you may be, there is always your mind, which is free to love and to hope. Dickens learnt this truth the hard way. His father was always falling into debt. But when the young Charles was 12, his father went bankrupt and had to go to a debtor's prison, the Marshalsea. Charles himself was sent to work in a factory where he filled and pasted labels on bottles and went hungry much of the time. The trauma of being taken away from school and from a respectable, happy life to hard labor, social shame, and isolation marked him for life and gave him a fellow feeling for oppressed children. Workers of the time were treated as objects, not people. As far as we know, Dickens spoke only once, many years later, about this time in his life. But he also told another story about it. One day, he fell down sick of a fever, Another boy, Fagin, who had also often teased him, made him a bed on the sacks, did his work too, and then tried to take him home. But Dickens did not want to be taken home, lest Fagin see his parents lived in a prison. So he kept staggering along for hours, hoping Fagin would give up. In the end, feverish as he was, Dickens pretended a random house was home and knocked there. It was the only way to lose his kind protector and keep his shame a secret. So even, but also especially among the poor, Dickens found kindness and a true humanity. On that evening, Fagin was his true home indeed. So his novels describe the impersonal forces that imperil human flourishing, but equally the human feeling and virtue that oppose and transcend them. And he found both in the blacking factory when he was 12 years old. But what is so wonderful about the writing of Dickens is that he emerges out of this traumatic time with enormous optimism and hope and joy in life. This, I think, is why G.K. Chesterton so loved his work and wrote 2 books about it. About Dickens' sunny outlook, he wrote, "As a fact, there is no shred of evidence to show that those who have had sad experiences tend to have a sad philosophy. There are numerous points upon which Dickens is spiritually at one with the poor, that is, with the great mass of mankind. But there is no point in which he is more perfectly at one with them than in showing that there is no kind of connection between a man being unhappy and a man being pessimistic. Sorrow and pessimism are indeed, in a sense, opposite things, since sorrow is founded on the value of something and pessimism on the value of nothing. Dickens values life as a good thing in itself, as if he were a student of Thomas Aquinas. And this means that even his most evil characters have an energy and a vitality about them. For Thomas himself said that even Satan has the good of existence. One of the most monstrous of Dickens' villains is Daniel Quilp, the miniature sadist who hunts down little Nell and her grandfather in the old curiosity shop, who is dwarfish, hook-nosed, and wields a club. He eats eggs whole with the shell on and terrorizes his wife with grimaces and pinches. He is really a human version of the Mr. Punch Pulcinella of the marionette theatre, who beats his wife and baby and has the same manic energy and fixed grin. He has a habit of poking his head through windows, sometimes upside down, to startle and terrify his friends and relations. When he calls on his lawyer, he looks like Mr. Punch, hanging over the edge of the stage. The old curiosity shop is out of fashion these days, because of its heroine dying. But it is a wholly contemporary story because it shows the threat to the human person. It is not really Daniel Quilp, who never harms little Nell and ends up accidentally drowning himself in the River Thames. The danger is becoming an object, like the contents of the antique shop in which the child Nell spends her young life. When she travels to escape Quilp, she meets two Punch and Judy showmen and even earns money showing people round a waxworks display. In our day too, people can be treated as of no more account than commodities. We can feel that the world of consumerism wants us to be puppets, to respond to the lure of expensive goods. John Waters spoke of that at the meeting. Although little Nell dies, she resists becoming an object and establishes strong alternative networks of friendship and generosity in which people find value by trying to help and support the little girl. These continue after her death, which becomes a point of growth for the community. One of Dickens' greatest novels is Bleak House, written 10 years later, and it fully displays this double function of showing what imprisons us and also giving strong images of human fellowship. It has been dramatized well by the BBC several times. The threat here is represented by the High Court of Chancery, which is represented symbolically by the London fog. You can get quite lost in the law, as if it were a meaningless mist. Cases outlast clients, and lawyers grow fat on others' misery, while some claimants put their faith in the system and are seduced by its promise of justice. It is almost like St. Paul's view of the Jewish law as a system that creates sin and division. Characters are wards of court and can never grow up and flourish under its power. Whole areas of the country are mouldering away because they are caught up in some legal case. Does it sound familiar? Meanwhile, poverty is so endemic that there are children like Joe the crossing sweeper who have no parents or home and have never heard the gospel. On Joe's deathbed, the Our Father comes as something of a revelation. This all sounds rather depressing and hopeless, but it is not like that when you read the novel. Dickens has a third-person narrator who sounds like an Old Testament prophet and describes London stuck in a foggy soup, in which a heedless aristocracy are oblivious of their kinship with their fellow but impoverished citizens. Contrasting with this fulminating judgment, however, is a first-person narrative by a young girl, an orphan like Joe and illegitimate, but someone who has enormous reserves of faith, hope, and love. Esther Summerson is not perfect, but this is because she has been brought up to think herself of no account by her terrifying aunt. Pleasing others by her care and affection gives her pleasure. And it is through Esther as a center of holiness that the novel begins to weave positive and helpful social connections. The house of the novel's title is no longer bleak when Esther becomes its housekeeper, but a haven of justice and reconciliation. When the pompous Mrs. Pardiggle preaches at a poor family and tries to shower religious tracts on them, it is Esther who notices that the baby in the mother's arms is dead. It is Esther who honors the child and fetches other women to care for the mother, just as it is Esther who rescues other abandoned children and teaches them to read. Her albeit limited private benevolence stands in opposition to the didactic and judgmental piety of Mrs. Pardiggle and to that of Mrs. Jellyby, who works to convert pagans in Africa while our own children are unloved and neglected. If Dickens has a failing, it is in his inability to envisage any communal, social, or political agency for change. He rails against social evils, but equally against the moderate trade union association of the industrial workers in the coke town of hard times. Only individual charity can make friends of those it helps and forge personal connections that transform people. And in one sense, Dickens is right. St. Augustine long ago taught us to begin to love our family and friends and work outwards. Loving our neighbor begins with the person on our street before it can deal with the person across the world. Mrs. Jellyby's telescopic philanthropy will never work because it lacks that reciprocity of true personal connection. Only another human being can help Joe, the crossing sweeper, understand what it is to have a father, before he can understand what it means to call God Father. Dickens's novels always create these small but increasing groups of people of goodwill, all intimately connected to each other, and from whence social transformation can begin. Schools of community, if you like. For it is only through communion with real, physical, other people that we can withstand those amorphous and often demonic forces that imperil our true humanity. No doubt many of you use social media and connect with your friends through Facebook and other such sites. When such media make it easier to meet in the flesh and aid community, they are good. But in my country, 1 in 5 teenagers is bullied by such media. And even those who cannot can lose the sense of their real humanity in a virtual world. In the Victorian period, of which Dickens writes, society in the sense of the fashionable world was a similarly virtual world, because although people were meeting each other, they were often creating quite unreal and illusory public personae. It was a world fueled, like our own celebrity-obsessed time, by fame and the media. In his novel, Our Mutual Friend, Dickens analyzes the seduction and pull of such a world brilliantly through the veneerings and their circle. Veneer is a thin outer coating of a richer material than that of which an article is actually made. Shiny, sticky mahogany over chipboard, and that is the reality of credit in which they exist. As in our own day, such a world is underpinned by credit. Credit meaning your reputation, and credit as the money you borrow. In Little Dorrit, dodgy financiers abound, and fortunes fall like houses of playing cards. There is one particular star in the financial firmament, Mr. Merdle. Mr. Merdle was immensely rich, a man of prodigious enterprise, a Midas without the ears, who turned all he touched to gold. He was in everything good, from banking to building. He was in Parliament, of course. He was in the city, necessarily. He was chairman of this, trustee of that, president of the other. As is so often the case today, it is the government that supports the self-image of Mr. Merdle. It is represented in the novel by the Circumlocution Office, which is a bureaucratic hell for ordinary people needing help or information, but props up the financial world. In this novel, Dickens returns to those memories of the Marshalsea prison and has his heroine, Amy Dorrit, actually born there and grows up knowing no other home. She is actually rather fond of it and its inhabitants. But for its bankrupt inhabitants, it is very hard to escape, because how can you earn money to pay your debts shut up in a prison? Thanks to the researches of Amy Dorrit's friend, Arthur Clenham, a legacy allows the Dorrit family to leave the Marshalsea prison at last. But when he breaks the good news, Amy Dorrit asks, Mr. Clenham, will he pay all his debts before he leaves here? No doubt, all. All the debts for which he has been imprisoned here, all my life and longer? No doubt. There was something of uncertainty and remonstrance in her look, something that was not all satisfaction. He wondered to detect it and said, "You are glad that he should do so?" "Are you?" asked little Dorrit wistfully. "Am I most heartily glad?" "Then I ought to be." "And are you not?" "It seems to me hard," said little Dorrit, "that he should have lost so many years and suffered so much, and at last pay all the debts as well. It seems to me hard that he should pay in life and money too." Although Arthur Clenham sees Amy's view as wrong, in one sense she is right. Her father pays twice over, in time and in money. For he has lost his true humanity in prison and has become infantilized. We are now seeing in our time the harm debt can do to people. We have short-term loan companies in Britain which are allowed to charge gigantic amounts of interest and so trap people forever in debt. So a loan of, say, 50 euros can mount to 1,000 quite quickly, if not paid back. The Anglican Church is trying to set up credit unions to stop this practice, as our government will not ban it. We know how debt like this stops our true human flourishing. In little Dorrit, her father never loses the debtor's prison. The second part of the novel shows him traveling around Italy in style, but the prison bars are on his soul. Even his daughter is lost without a proper series of responsibilities and acts of love and service to perform. Her life of freedom seems unreal until one day in fashionable Rome, she has a vision. It appeared on the whole to little Dorrit herself that this same society in which they lived greatly resembled a superior sort of Marshalsea. Numbers of people seemed to come abroad, pretty much as people had come into the prison, through debt, through idleness, relationship, curiosity, and general unfitness for getting on at home. They were brought into these foreign towns in the custody of couriers and local followers, just as the debtors had been brought into the prison. They prowled about the churches and picture galleries, much in the old, dreary prison house manner. They were usually going away again tomorrow or next week, and rarely knew their own minds, and seldom did what they said they would do. or went where they said they would go. In all this again, very much like the prison debtors. Perhaps to Italian eyes, tourist groups today similarly seem like prisoners, trailing round after their jailers, without much obvious interest in what they see. For Amy Dorrit, the prison has become a lens in which to understand the world, and it stops her from being dazzled by her new wealth. This is just as well, because she and Arthur Clenham are beggared by the financier Myrtle and his false speculation. The whole Tower of Babel of London society is affected and falls in ruins. Clenham ends up being nursed back to health by Amy in the old Marshalsea prison again. But they do get out and are married. And we see them at the end of the novel go down into the teeming streets of London to love and serve and make community. To fit our theme of human emergency, I have stressed in this short talk the dark side of Dickens, where he explores the way in which our humanity and freedom is entrapped by false ideas and immense social and economic forces. But although he has no radical, thoroughgoing answer, when you read his novels, the life and energy of his characters, as Annalisa said, is quite gigantic and even grotesque. Nothing can keep a Dickens character down while there is a pipe to be smoked, hot rum punch to be brewed, and stories to be told round a roaring fire. And who else could give you a fiery, wheelchair-bound doll's dressmaker, a Sarah Gamp midwife with an umbrella and an imaginary friend, a clerk who lives in a suburban miniature castle with a drawbridge and a cannon, an elegant boy pickpocket like the artful Dodger, or Noddy Boffin, a millionaire from rubbish. This again is why Chesterton loved Dickens. He writes, "The intoxicating variety of men," that was his vision and conception of human brotherhood. And certainly it is a great part of human brotherhood. In one sense, things can only be equal if they are entirely different. When characters become heroic in Dickens, they become even more like themselves and no one else. They become even funnier. No matter how powerful the bureaucracy of the law or the circumlocution office or the prison, individual humanity will break out. And laughing at these powerful institutions or people is the way to gain a true perspective. It was Dickens' insight that the English, in particular, are all a little mad, a little eccentric, and that is their human strength. I must let Chesterton have the last word. This is the real gospel of Dickens. The inexhaustible opportunities offered by the liberty and the variety of man. It is the utterly unknown people who can grow in all directions like an exuberant tree. It is in our interior lives, at home, that we find people are too much themselves. It is in our private life that we find them swelling into enormous contours and taking on the colors of caricature. Many of us live publicly with featureless public puppets, images of the small public abstractions. It is when we pass our own private gate and open our own secret door that we step into the land of giants. And so I invite you to step into the land of giants, which is the world of Dickens, where humanity is alive and well, and community and laughter await you. Thank you.
Ringrazio di cuore la professoressa Milbank, che in una delle ultime battute che ha detto che i personaggi di Dickens non stanno mai a testa bassa. E dicendo questo, ascoltando le sue...
And listening to her words, she made us remember once again that studying literature, opening a book, is not in fact lowering one's gaze in the world, but rather lifting one's gaze up to the world. She has told us that studying literature doesn't mean studying in a library or writing footnotes, but it means opening up fertile views onto the world. And this Victorian author, in fact, shows us the worlds that we and the problems we have today, our world, the difficulties, the questions of education, and so on. Now, let me not interrupt this meeting, and I'd like to give the floor right away to Professor Edoardo Rialti. I'd like to thank him very much for coming as well. Many of you will know him very well. I'd just like to give you some brief information on the great work that he's doing. Edoardo teaches comparative literature in Italy and Canada. He's also a journalist and works with Il Foglio, where he writes of literature. And in one of his articles, I remember articles on the bibliography of Chesterton and Lewis. And these articles were put together in publications entitled The Man Who Smiles and Surprising Infinity. He also has published widely on Anglo-American literature, Tolkien, Shakespeare, and so on. But I won't go on because there's such a long list. Just let me say that vis-a-vis what we're talking about this morning, he edited an edition which brings together Chesterton's writings on Dickens, which is called A New and Ancient Joy, is the translation in English of this work. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for being here. Welcome. I'd like to read one first passage from one of Dickens's work, which is most funny and most famous, the Pickwick Papers, as it's a huge ethic of laughter, and like Don Quixote of Cervantes was loved by Pirandello, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky. Pickwick Papers has many stories which seems to contradict the idea of laughter and fun. there's very harsh stories. In one of these stories, he talks about a family whose father is imprisoned and put in a debtor's prison, and every day the wife and child go to the prison to exchange a few words, and one day she failed to come, Dickens wrote, for the first time. Another morning arrived and she came alone. The child died. And Dickens adds, they little know who coldly talk of the poor man's bereavement as a happy release from pain to the departed and a merciful relief from expense to the survivor. They little know, I say, what the agony of these bereavements is. A silent look of affection and regard when all other eyes are turned coldly away, the consciousness that we possess the sympathy and affection of one being when all others have deserted us, is a hold, a stay, a comfort in the deepest affliction, which no wealth could purchase or power bestow. They little know. In fact, all Dickens' works are based on the contrast between two cities. In fact, the Tale of Two Cities is one of his works, of course, but we have two cities within one city, the city of plenty and the city of quality and quantity. In fact, Dickens talks directly to his readers, asking him to see one thing very clearly that is true in our life, and this happens to all human beings. He said, but it is the same with any life, he says. Imagine one selected day struck out of it and think how different its course would have been. Pause, you who read this, and think for a moment of the long chain of iron or gold, of thorns or flowers, that would never have bound you, but for the formation of the first link on one memorable day. Dickens says that we all have change, we are all bound. The question is, what are we bound to? That's the issue. There's this city in the world of quantity, there are chains of those, and it doesn't really matter if they're victims or executioners, because Dickens, in fact, makes no social distinction. Even the poorest of the poor can be proud as Satan. But they are slaves to the world of quantity, to the world of what can be measured and controlled and managed. It can be economic power of Scrooge, the miser Scrooge, who said in the Christmas Carol, it's best that the poor die, he says, so that population excess gets reduced. Or Fagin, the cap of the young thieves. It can be also social power. It can be the power of cruelty of Quilt, or the psychological sadism of the masters of the poor school, like Master Squilts, who receives with a sort of erotic pleasure almost, and receives new children into his school so that he can, in fact, beat them. But the most terrible power is the power of Mrs. Pardiggle, this sort of horrible woman who goes among the poor distributing religious leaflets as if she were a machine without ever stopping to actually meet anybody. Now, all these people, all these characters who cede to the blackmail of the world of quantity, wanting it, or being able to ride the crest of the wave, they all have something in common. They have a desert around them and a desert inside them. At a certain point, a convict tells his life to a young character, tells of a world that doesn't see him he says that it doesn't take a lot for a person like him to sell his story. In other words, the convict just says, in jail and out of jail, in jail and out of jail, in jail and out of jail. Here's the longer version. That's it. As far as I can remember, there was no living soul that looked into Abel, the convict, except with fear, or to kick him out or to arrest him. And this desert can be seen in the consequences that happened to many characters, convicts like Abel, the hunger of Oliver Twist, who goes and says, may I have some more, sir? In David Copperfield, it's seen when he is at school, isolated and despised by his relatives, or the small Smike, the retarded boy who is the main object of the violence of Professor Squills. But, and this is the interesting part, what I said before is also true here. Dickens makes no social distinctions in this inner desert. One can be poor and evil, and one can be also very much wounded inside, because Miss Havisham in Great Expectations, the rich woman who passes her whole life trying to raise a younger, more beautiful girl and make her into a monster of gelid indifference who, in fact, should be trained to break the hearts of all young men. This woman, who is considered crazy because she goes around in her tattered wedding dress, living among the wedding cake, which is crumbling, with all clocks that are stopped on the day of her wedding, when her groom, whom she thought wanted to marry her because he loved her and wanted her, just a few hours before the wedding abandoned her after having got her to hand over most of her property. And everything stopped at that moment of abandonment. And even Fagin, the head of the young band of thieves, who is a wretched person in the slums, finally, when he comes to trial, he, a Jew, Dickens calls him, saying, the Jew was alone, surrounded by a set of hostile eyes, and this disgusting person, who also tried to kill Oliver Twist, for a moment, for a short circuit, paradoxical short circuit, we see the image of another Jew crucified 2,000 years before. So this is the world of quantity, that invisible chain that Scrooge sees in the night of Christmas, when he sees other misers. He says, we are chained forever, but you too, Scrooge, who seem to be free, you too drag a similar chain. So what breaks this chain? There's no social program, as was quite rightly said by Professor Milbank. Dickens does not have a general view of how to improve society. He just sees one opportunity. He knows only one alternative. He knows that there's just one chain, one thing that can break that chain, and that is the chain of the world of quality, of a gaze full of love and compassion. I'd like to read the passage that has already been quoted by the professor. I'd like to read it in Italian, from Bleak House. Mrs. Pardigo goes around the poor, and she gets to a home which is horrible and dirty, and this is what she says. Along with us in that stinking room, there was a woman with a livid eye who, in fact, held a child that had difficulty in breathing. And then there was a drunken man which was on the ground drunk, and also another boy with a dog, and a child who was washing with dirty water. Everybody looked up at our entry, and it looked like the girl looked to the fire to hide her eye. This is the world of desert, and Mrs. Particle worsens that world when she comes in and says, "Well, dear friends," says Mrs. Particle with a tone that didn't seem at all friendly, "how are you? I'm here yet again. You won't be able to tire me. I like to work a lot and I keep my word," she says. And then she starts handing out religious leaflets. And the man with the pipe says something. Says, "Well, let's do things. Get it over with," says the man. "Get it over with." This intrusion into my home stops. I'm tired of feeling myself like somebody who's being wheedled out of his den. And Mrs. Pardo said, "You haven't prepared any questions. This is how we live," says the man. "You don't like it? And what do you think of Jeannie? My house is dirty." "Yes, it is dirty. Of course it's dirty, and it's not very healthy. And we have had 5 unhealthy, ill children who have all died. And that, in fact, is a good thing for us." If you had read the leaflet that I left you last time, says Mrs. Particle. Did you read it? No, nobody has read it. We can't read, and anyway, it's not for me. The man took his pipe, had taken his pipe out of his mouth to speak, and then put it in again, said, "I'm not going to church. Nobody will wait for me. The sexton is too refined for me. And how come my wife has a swollen eye? Well, I gave it to her, and she says that I didn't give it to her. She's a liar." Mrs. Particle then gives her sermon and then leaves. As soon as the room was empty, we went to the woman who was sitting by the fire. Mrs. Particle, in fact, had never really entered that room. But once she left, we went to the woman who was by the fire and asked whether the child was ill. The woman who was holding him in her arms continued to gaze at him. We realized before that she tried to cover her swollen eye as if she wanted to forget any ill treatment that she had received. Ada, moved by the look of the child, bent down to touch his face, have physical contact, in other words. And at that moment, I realized of what had happened, and I stopped her. The child had died. And Esther, says Ada, falling to her knees, "Look, Esther, look, my dear, this poor little child, calm and suffering. I'm so sorry for him. I'm so sorry for the mother. I never saw a sight so pitiful as this before. Oh, baby, baby. Oh, baby, baby." Such compassion, such gentleness as that with which she bent down, weeping, to put her hand upon the mother's, might have softened any mother's heart that ever beat. The woman at first gazed at her in astonishment and then burst into tears. Presently I took the light burden from her lap, did what I could to take the baby's rest the prettier and gentler, laid it on a shelf, and covered it with my own handkerchief. And we tried to comfort the mother, and we whispered to her what our Saviour said of children. She answered nothing, but sat weeping very much. When I turned, I found that the young man had taken out the dog and was standing at the door looking in upon us with dry eyes, but quiet. The girl was quiet too, and sat in a corner looking on the ground. The man had risen. He still smoked his pipe with an air of defiance, but he was silent. The house has changed, in other words. The same house that before was a horrible animal den has become a sacred home, not because anything had changed. The child remains dead, but the human level within the room had changed. Suddenly, everything becomes stiller. There was the freedom of being able to weep and cry together. This is the enchantment which is decisive for Dickens. Another city within a city, in other words. This gaze, which is like a hand extended, a hand extended to our weaknesses and our needs. That's something more, which in Oliver Twist can be hunger, which in David Copperfield can be loneliness, which in Abel, the convict, means compassion, which with Miss Havisham means the despair because her heart was broken and thrown away. And here too, the social classes, in fact, do not count. This enchantment can be developed by the anonymous friend of Oliver Twist, who can only say good luck when Oliver escapes. Or it can be a person who takes Oliver Twist in, or the rich bettor who bets on Oliver Twist when his friends see just another little thief. But it can also be Mr. Micawber, who takes in David Copperfield, always in debt but always smiling. And the same convict, Abel, helped for a brief moment by a young child, when he comes back infinitely rich, will become the secret benefactor. Perhaps the most representative image of this enchantment is the little Tim, the lame child in Christmas Carol, and he is the only face that breaks the enchantment of the chains that hold Scrooge. Why? Because Scrooge, who has already seen the ghost of Christmas past, saw the child that he was, the man of hope as a young man, but he in fact got entwined in the enchantment of money. He started to chase after economic wealth over emotions and feelings. He saw this so distant and as a promise which had never been fulfilled. The scourge of a human life, ill spelt, little Tim is the real ghost of Christmas present, because he gives Scrooge back to himself. He allows Scrooge, now old and wicked and grumpy, little Tim allows Scrooge to be what he was. Little Tim hands the real Scrooge back to the old Scrooge. And in fact, this doesn't get round social inefficiency. This is the only spur to be able to overcome the problems of solitude, poverty, and the workhouse, to avoid that the solutions put forward are not those of solutions of Mrs. Particle, but rather are truly humane solutions. Nicholas Nickleby, he shouts no when he sees the young child beaten, and he takes the cane and raises it against the wicked teacher. And Scrooge, who is saved by little Tim, he is the person who can finally find a meaning for his width by saving the physical health of that sick, lame child. And this is the battle that we see in all Dickens's work. There are two cities that his characters live in. At the beginning of The Tale of Two Cities, he says, strange circumstance, he says, worthy of meditation. The fact that every person remains a secret and a profound mystery for everybody else. When you enter a large city at night, each one of these houses, darkened houses, closes within itself a particular secret. In every room there is a particular secret, and every pulsating heart in the thousands hundreds of thousands of souls in that city, each one is locked within his own thoughts. Here there's a sense of terror equal to death. In every place of burial in the cities he goes through, there is a sleeping person that is more inscrutable than those who lie in the cemetery, more inscrutable than what I am for them. The great surprise in the works of Dickens is not so much that somebody can burst into our house and our home trying to deliver light and happiness like Mrs. Particle. It's this surprise with which Nicholas Nickleby, saving Smike, can say, "Where is your home?" And little Smike says, "I am your home." This is the real surprise that Dickens gives us, the fact that our mystery is in the home of somebody else, in the eyes of somebody else, more than in our own profound depths. And this is what all children discover, and all Dickens' stories have as their characters either children or men who are saved by their encounter with children. And in fact, it's quite true that the secret symphony of this quality city is this. One can become grown up, remaining children. That's the message. One can, in fact, develop this enchantment. One can become as hard as flint and as old and go back to being children when we meet that extended hand, which is the gaze of somebody else, where we can find our home. Thank you.
La mia unica parola conclusiva.
My only word of conclusion can just be a word of great thanks. I'd already said there were many of us when we started listening to these presentations, and now we've come to the conclusion. I think we're many, many more, because both Professor Milbank and Professor Rialti have brought into this room so many other men into this room. And that's what literature does. The stories are a window onto the world. They help us to deal with reality. They help us to go out into the world through a window. It's not just a series of facts on pieces of paper. They are opportunities to go out and meet the world. I would suggest that you make your companions the characters that Professors Milbank and Rialti have introduced to you to today, and I'd like to invite you to listen to them. And Rialti said today, stop, you who are reading, look around you. You can perhaps find the voice of a child like Oliver Twist, who is asking, please sir, can I have some more? Or the voice of Louisa, who said, what happened to the garden that should have blossomed in my life? So let's all listen to these voices. Thank you, and thank you very much to our guests.